This is the Web Platform Podcast, episode number 111, Extensible Web Components. I got through an opening without messing it up.
You nailed it.
On our panel today, we have Justin Ribeiro.
Hello, wonderful people.
Danny Blue.
Everybody.
And myself, Eric Isaacson. We have a special guest today, Jeremy Keith. You want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name's Jeremy. I'm from Ireland originally, living in Brighton in England now, working at a design agency called Clear Left that I co-founded 11 years ago. And I spend my days goofing off on the web.
That's pretty good.
And you've done a lot of speaking and a lot of discussions on progressive enhancement and the web in general and working on the web, not just at the development level, but also the user experience level. So it's been pretty exciting stuff. Today we brought you on to talk about your blog post that you had on Extensible Web Components, and which I thought was really well done. And then I read the one that you cited from Adam Onishi, if I pronounced his name correctly. Which was also really good. It's things that I didn't really think about as much when designing with web components. So do you want to talk a little bit about that and what that means, extensible web components?
Sure. You're right. I don't think this does get talked about enough. And what I mean by this is, I guess, the kind of backwards compatibility in web components, which weirdly I actually think is tied to for web components, an adoption path, an upgrade path, if you will, for web components. I think historically, looking at the history of web technologies, if you've got good backwards compatibility, then it offers people a good reason to get started with any technology. Anyway, I guess the broad point is that web components give us developers the kind of power that was previously only held by browser makers, right? The power to create new elements and encapsulate within those elements. Being handed this power, and it's the whole idea of the Extensible Web Manifesto, right? That we get access to these low-level APIs. But insert Spider-Man quote here, because when browser makers are coming up with new elements for HTML, they think a lot, the standards process, they think a lot about backwards compatibility, how people can begin to use this stuff today without alienating users, we say older browsers and stuff like that. And I don't see enough of that thinking going into web components. Now, to be fair, web components themselves are actually, the technology is very agnostic, right? I mean, you can use them in many different ways. My concern is that when we see a lot of the examples, we see a lot of people, promoting web components, all of the examples seem to have jumped straight ahead to, okay, so everyone's using web components, and this is the world we live in now, and we can just assume that these work everywhere, with polyfills and all that, instead of maybe considering a gentler upgrade path to how we can begin using this stuff today without alienating the people who, won't get the benefit of them directly. I guess that was kind of my main thing, is that we're thinking about backwards compatibility when it comes to web components.
And backwards compatibility has been hard for the web overall, right? I mean, as we've sort of gone to an extensible sort of platform where you have a lot of primitives at the lower level that you can build on top of. Primitives are great, but making sure backwards compatibility is there in terms of what users are using now, because you see that a lot where you have the disconnect between for instance, the mobile platform. In a perfect world, it's an evergreen, wonderful land, but in reality, it's actually not. How do you sort of begin to sort of deal with that problem? What is an approach that you would probably take today to use some of those things?
Yeah, it's like this turned into a therapy session. But the main thing is to be okay with it, like to recognize that we can try and make assumptions about what devices or browsers or networks that users will be using when they access our stuff, but actually, we're only fooling ourselves. And it's always been the case. In the past, we made assumptions about the size of monitors that people would have. It was 640 by 480, and then it was 800 by 600, and then it was 1024, right? And then later on as well, everyone's using desktop PCs. We can at least agree on that. And then mobile came along, right? So all these assumptions keep getting torpedoed. But that's okay. Like, it's, in a way, it's better to have your assumptions torpedoed, because then you're accepting the reality of the web and the reality of the world, which is that, yeah, it is lumpy and it is messy, and there's people using all kinds of devices and all kinds of, network conditions. And that's fine, because it means you may have to change how you work, how you approach building for the web to accommodate that, but you'd be building in a more kind of honest way, I think. And when it comes to web components, you can accommodate that. You can think about that, still use web components, in a sort of responsible way. But you're right, this has always been a question on the web, is sort of how do we move the web forward and yet maintain backwards compatibility? And that's something that's built into the design principles of HTML5, that even though we're introducing new APIs and new features, we should still think about backwards compatibility. So in Canvas or video or audio, the content model is deliberately set up so that you can put fallback content in there for browsers that don't understand Canvas or audio or video. And we could be using web components in a similar way. Take a leaf out of the browser makers' books and see how they've done it.
And you said you judge in your blog post that you had. You said that you judge technologies by how well they fail and how well they work. So looking at the web component specs, there's the 4 of them. There's the custom elements, the HTML imports, templates, and Shadow DOM, of course. How would you kind of look at those technologies? Would you look at them as a whole, or would you look at them as separate pieces? And
yeah, that's a good one. Both of us have their benefits. I think it's nice to have this term, web components, that we can all use, and then we understand that we're talking about a suite of technologies. But sometimes you do want to get in on the specifics. And probably mostly what I'm talking about when I talk about backwards compatibility with web components is I'm probably focusing on custom elements. I think that's probably the main thing. Like when you create a custom element, what happens if something goes wrong, either at the the JavaScript level, at the Shadow DOM level, wherever. But if it fails or it isn't supported, how well does it fail? So I suppose I am mostly looking at custom elements there. I guess that's the most visible part, right? That's the bit you see, as a user, I guess, as a developer, that you see exposed is, insert this new element into your page. So I'm mostly thinking about custom elements, and then that's the question I ask is, how well does it fail? Which I find a very useful question to ask about most technologies. The obvious question to ask is, how well does it work, right? The technology claims to be able to do X, well, we can evaluate it by how well it does X. But it can be equally valuable to ask how well it fails, especially on the web. Like quite often we're trying to decide whether to use a technology or not. We'll do something like check caniuse.com to see what the browser support is like. And there we can see with the green technology, and with the red we see which browsers don't support that technology. But the red doesn't tell you anything more than that. It doesn't tell you, so what, right? So what if the browser doesn't support the technology?
What happens,
so an example
if that happens, right?
Yeah, exactly. What would happen if the browser doesn't support the technology? So you could look up one thing, like say a CSS feature, right? For, I don't know, border radius or shape outside, that adds, a visual enhancement to what you're building. And you'd see a whole bunch of red, maybe not for border radius, but you would for shape outside, right? For CSS shapes. And you might think, oh, there's a lot of red, therefore I can't use this because it doesn't work in these browsers. But when you dive deeper and you examine what happens when CSS shapes aren't supported, it's like, oh, it's actually no big deal. So instead of text wrapping in a circle, the text just goes down in a straight line like it always would have done. So it fails well. Now, other technologies, if they're not supported, depending on how you're using that technology, it could be a make or break situation, right? So, classic example, if you're using React or Angular, any of these sort of big monolithic frameworks that come with it, the assumption that the JavaScript all loads fine and then executes fine and everything works out all okay. If something were to happen along the way, so that, maybe there's one wrong line in the JavaScript, or something happens on the network, or something happens on the server in the browser, that assumption turns out to be false, then it fails really badly, because it's one big monolithic chunk of JavaScript and all it takes is one error and the whole thing falls down. Compared to say something like HTML or CSS, they fail really, really well, because if there's an error, the browser just goes, yeah, forget about it, and skips over it and carries on. So I rather use technologies that fail well. And in the case of web components, and yes, I am talking specifically, I guess, custom elements, we can deploy them in such a way that they'll fail well, or we can deploy them in such a way that they'll fail badly.
So why do you think that the specs are so? How do I put this without like getting myself in trouble? So there's there's like version 1 right now for custom elements, right? Since we're talking about custom elements, and there was V0 before. And so this is the first time I brought this up on the podcast before, that browser vendors are all excited about it thing in here. But the problem is that, it doesn't really fit like how they view what should be in their browsers. And so you have to have compromises. And it can get, the face-to-face meetings I haven't been to, but I've seen the notes on those, and it seems like it can get a little heated. And those guys work really hard, and they do a lot of great work. And gals, a lot of people working on all that stuff to make it better. Why do you think that this has not been a big issue coming up at those meetings, or
well,
yeah.
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right. It's not fun to see how the sausage is made when it comes to how this stuff gets into our browsers. I will defer our listeners to the episode with Brian Cardell, right, where he gets into detail about exactly how standards get done.
Yeah, he's awesome.
He's great, and it is a messy process, but sometimes that's what makes it good, right? That the compromise that they have to go through. So in the case of web components, because they are essentially just giving us these low-level APIs, exposing what's sort of already there in the browser, it is all down to the implementation, as in what we decide to do with those web components. With one glaring exception where there is a lot of controversy and there is a lot of heated discussion. And that's with the idea of extending an existing element, and the whole idea of in a declarative way, that is, using the is syntax. I don't know if you've seen, but like there's very heated thread on GitHub going back about this.
Reddit
WebKit have really, they've drawn a line in the sand and said, we absolutely will not implement this. The other browsers saying, we think this is a really good idea, we're going to implement it anyway. That's getting pretty heated.
And when you run into situations like that, it makes it more difficult. And I would like to get into exactly like what that syntax is and what it's for, and why it can be really important to extensible web components. But just that that rift can make it very difficult to do it, because anybody remembers, again, reference the episode that you just referenced from quite a few weeks ago. When you have different browsers that treat different things differently, it becomes even more difficult to have things progressively enhance. It's harder to have a fallback because you have to start counting on fallbacks for very specific things.
Yeah, and the browser makers have their hands tied with certain things. So it's not about coming up with the best idea, right? So here's a problem we're trying to solve in web browsers, and someone comes up with an idea, and the idea is great, but it turns out, great idea, but we can't implement it because of some historical reason. I'll give you an example. Over and over again in discussions, something will come up, some way of declaring some sort of metadata or something to do with the page. Maybe it's to do with responsive images, maybe it's to do with some other challenge. And someone suggests, well, we add a new element to the head of the page. The idea is sound, the idea is technically great, but somebody from a browser vendor will come in and go, great idea, we can't do that. Because the way that the parsing model of HTML works, if a browser, any of the browsers now, see any element other than title, link, meta, style, or script in the head of a document, they will assume that the head is done and they should automatically open the body element. So until the end of time, browsers cannot add any new elements to the head of an HTML document. It's just not going to happen.
And so that example is not specifically, and I think it's important to understand, like, that is not something that is specific to just a bad implementation that one of the browsers have done. That's how HTML, that's how the parsing model for HTML, that's how it works.
Yes, although the parsing model for HTML is based on the existing browser behavior. There's a dance that goes on here, right? Okay. It's not like the standards get specified, then browsers implement it. It's also not quite that browsers implement whatever they want and then the standards, write that down. There's some dance between the two. And in this case, when the browser makers all came together with HTML5 to say, okay, let's specify how we're going to handle HTML documents, especially the error handling, because that had never been specified before. They did base it on, well, what do we currently do? And kind of enshrine that as the authoring model. So yes, it is now baked into HTML, but it's baked in because that's what the browser was doing. So you know, there's a chicken and egg thing going on there. But that's just one example of how there's historical reasons why some avenues are effectively closed off because of something that happened in the past, and that can be frustrating. Yeah.
Yeah, that brings me to one thing. I'm going to skip a little and then go back, but there was a quick lightning talk that Soledad Peñanes did. She's from Mozilla. And she used to work on Brick. She was on an old episode that we had on here, which is a web components library, or was. It's still on GitHub, but it's just not worked on. She did something at the Extensible Web Summit in Berlin, and she discussed hard topics like, you know, what's wrong with the shadow DOM, and to no surprise, also she talked especially critical about the HTML imports spec, which is something that Microsoft has also said, you know, we want to see how the JavaScript imports work. And, you know, Alex Russell had argued also that, you know, it should be more declarative how we pull these in. And when you said that things couldn't load in the head, it made me think of that because you have to really load your link tags with the imports in that way inside of the head of the document. And that just tells the browser, hey, this is one of those elements that you can use. So what are your thoughts on that?
To be honest, I haven't paid that much attention. I know there's the different schools of thought, and a lot of it seems to come down to the, you know, the performance and the way that link elements are currently handled. Generally, is, you know, you go off and you fetch the thing, and then come back and continue parsing, and that's not going to fly, right? We want to get a faster performance for the initial document. So I understand why. Would I be right in saying that the HTML imports is probably the part of web components that's moving slowest when it comes to browser implementation? That, you know, there's generally a bit more agreement on custom elements and more agreement on shadow DOM, but HTML imports, like, yeah, not so sure. That kind of makes sense. As soon as you're doing anything to do with fetching resources, things get messy, things get ugly, and I leave that to the browser makers. I leave it in their hands. And so it's not anything that I particularly have an opinion on, but I totally understand why it's a source of, you know, debate and contention between what's the best way to do it. And undoubtedly, the reasons are going to be, you know, not philosophical or what's the ideal way to do it, but okay, given that this is the way that browsers work and we have to work within those constraints, how do we get HTML imports to work? Yeah, I feel for that.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is that they get optimized imports, especially once you have that HTTP2 model, right, where you're having smaller pieces, but, you know, we have a lot of things like she talked about, you know, it breaks linting chains, and we have Vulcanizer, which concatenates all these into one large one for, you know, HTTP1 type of requests. But it adds a lot of dependencies that are not necessarily related, so there's a lot of complex things there.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to see that one of the things that's been changing in browsers lately is how they deal with link elements within a body of a document, and that they'll actually make it blocking like they would in the head if it was for, you know, a style sheet, for example. And in a way, that could be good news for web components. You know, everyone's getting into the idea of componentization, modularity, that we have our, you know, here's my component on the page, and in my style sheet, I've got the styles for that component in one place, and there's all this idea of pattern libraries and style guides to manage that. But what if literally, and this is in the HTTP2 world, connections, what if literally before the header in my document, I have a link to the style sheet just for header, and before the footer, I have a link to the style sheet just for footer, and before that web component, I have a link to the style sheet just for that web component, and likewise for the JavaScript to go with that particular component, that you actually keep them together in the DOM, that you keep them together. You know, here's the HTML, here's the link to the styles, and here's the link to the JavaScript, you know, to run the web component, rather than it all having to be bundled up in the head. It's an interesting development that the elements in body has been examined also by the browsers. But I think you're onto something there with the fact that the web component model starts to make a lot more sense with HTTP2, right? Well, particularly here, you're right. It's about HTML imports, right? But, you know, if I've got 10 web components on my page, that means I'm going to have 10 imports pointing off to 10 files or more. And I can totally understand where Soledad was coming from, but it definitely is going to get messy, because what happens in those imports if they reference something else and something depends on something in a previous import? We already have issues with JavaScript and async and defer and dependencies like that. It's definitely a tricky area.
Yeah. So I wanna rewind just a little bit, because I said I was going to bring it back up, but we briefly mentioned the is attribute.
Mhm.
Is it it's an attribute, right? Not a property.
Yeah.
Yeah.
An attribute, an HTML. Yeah.
Yeah.
The corresponding. So yeah, attribute in HTML, and then the corresponding JavaScript DOM that would be starts life as an attribute. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. But so one, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about. We already said that a lot of people don't agree about is the implementers. Some have said, yes, we're going to do it. This is a great idea. Some have said we're not going to do this. This is a terrible idea for X, Y, or Z reason. So regardless of that, if everybody had agreed, can we go over a little bit what the is attribute is, and why it can be important for progressive enhancement and for things failing well?
Yeah, I think what it would do is maybe make the person creating the web component, the custom element, make them think a bit more about what exactly they're making. Because right now, when you create, my dash fancy element, what's kind of being hidden from you is what that behaves like in, if the custom element, if the web component stuff isn't supported, which is basically behaves as a span. Now, if you had to write span is my dash fancy component, maybe you'd stop a bit more and go, well, span isn't quite what I mean. It's a kind of, and you'd stop, maybe think about what's the closest existing HTML element that works. So there's a lot of examples where it's, the button is the classic example, or the select, right? It's like, okay, and now it's, instead of it behaving like a span, if the web component support isn't there, it'll at least behave like a button or a select. And in that blog post by Adam Onishi had a really nice example of, an image gallery and how the backwards compatibility could work there. And that's a tricky one, because there isn't really an existing element like that. But, you can imagine using a nav element and extending it to be a mega menu, right? You could imagine, a select that you extend to be a multiple select or something like that. So by having that, at least as an option, that you can extend elements, I would hope that it would make authors think a bit more.
Yeah, I think Adam brought up the input tag, right, for like date,
right?
And yes, how when that falls back, it falls back to
my fancy input. Yeah, that was a good example. Yeah, at least it exposes what's going on under the hood. That what you're doing is you're taking this existing element and sort of uplifting it, because that's what's happening anyway with web components. It's just the existing element you're uplifting is always going to be a span. Unless you use some kind of extensible method like is. So that's why I like it. I like is. Now that said, I'm not wedded to the syntax. It's not like I think is the perfect attribute or anything like that. It's just some way of declaratively being able to say this regular HTML element is going to get turned into a fancy HTML element. And I think the WebKit people, I think their opposition was the fact that it being declarative, and they I believe, and I need to get clarification on this, I believe they aren't against extensibility per se, that you could take an existing element rather than just a blank HTML element and extend it, but that they do it declaratively. I think they're okay with doing it in the JavaScript. But from my point of view, at that point, it's too late. Like, you're already in the JavaScript. It doesn't. You might as well extend a span at that point.
Yeah, you bring up a good point too with the extensibility being declarative. I like that, and that's one of the reasons I like the import idea too. And as far as implementation, I'm for imports especially, that doesn't matter to me. It's more of that you have a declarative interface,
right?
So
exactly.
that you can do this. Something like
I don't care about the syntax. I just want some declarative way of being able to do it.
Yeah, and I think Bruce Lawson, another great web hero, he was talking about the Extensible Web Manifesto, and he also said from that same summit, that he's already heard potential good ideas for extensions to core HTML, hand waved away that, oh, that's the job for web components. And so I'm not yet entirely convinced that we're not heralding a new era of JavaScript-only web development. I don't want to see the fossilization of declarative web and a new programmer priesthood reemerge. So do you feel we are allowing this JavaScript-only way of thinking to guide our specs and design and browser implementation?
I think it's a danger, yes. And actually what Bruce touched on there is probably my biggest fear for the web. Sort of pulling out here big philosophical, big picture stuff. I think it's hugely important that the web is for everyone, as Tim Berners-Lee famously put it. And that doesn't mean just for everyone to access, but for everyone to create. Now, there's an argument to be had here, but I would say as a broad sweeping statement that declarative is easier to learn than imperative languages. Something like HTML is easier to learn than JavaScript. Something like CSS is easier to learn. Just because with JavaScript, it's a programming language. You have to get your head around variables and loops and ifs and thens, and it's got that tougher error handling where if you got one character wrong, it could cause everything to fail, right? Whereas the loose error handling that goes with declarative languages and the relative similarity to languages we understand means that people can learn them. And I'm not talking about people who do web development professionally. I'm talking about anyone who wants to make a website. I might be a bit naive there, but I think it's really important that at least that door remains open, that theoretically anybody could pick up a text editor and make a website, right? So yeah, my biggest fear, I think probably along with Bruce, is that the web becomes something, frankly, for professionals, something that only an elite priesthood can do. And even amongst there, since it becomes something that you have to know JavaScript, and it's not about JavaScript, it's about the fact that it's an imperative programming language, a real programming language, that you'd have to learn that just to put some text on the screen. Barrier to entry, that it keeps the web for creation on the web to a small number of people instead of being open to everyone. So this is why in broad strokes, I prefer declarative solutions over imperative solutions, depending on what the problem space is, obviously. But in general, I'm going to favor it for new web features because it keeps the barrier to entry lower. There are some things that have to be done in JavaScript, and that's absolutely fine. So yeah, that fear of the possibility of creating a web page getting narrowed is a real one. And yes, I do see in the standards work where different constituents are being considered, like how will this go down with this group of people, and how will this group of people feel about this. I do see people considering, well, web professionals who are building, how will they take to this new spec to do with web components, for example. That's the constituency that's being thought of, and not enough about, okay, how does somebody who's making their very first website get to grips with this stuff? And I know those are kind of two extremes, but maybe there's a balance to be struck, and we find good solutions that could be applicable to both. But yeah, I do see that the point of view that browser makers, standards makers seem to be taking more and more is the point of view of the professional web developer who already does everything in JavaScript. And so it seems like the path to least resistance is, well, let's make sure we build it in JavaScript. And there's good reasons to build some things in JavaScript, expose some things in JavaScript. Actually, I think the best solutions are both. The best solutions are when you have a declarative way, and there's also a JavaScript way. So a good example of that would be in HTML5, we got a whole bunch of declarative ways of doing form validation, right? The required attribute, input type equals email, autocomplete, all this kind of stuff, right? But it wasn't just declarative. You didn't just get that in HTML. There was a corresponding JavaScript API that you could use, and you could fiddle with that stuff. And generally, when new features are introduced, there's the declarative layer, and then there's the corresponding programmatic layer. Same with video and audio. You can just write a video tag and write controls and all these other attributes and do it declaratively, or you can use JavaScript. Do it all with JavaScript. Both options are open. The problem arises when there's something that's only available in one and not the other. I'll give you an example. In HTML5, we also got geolocation. Why isn't there a geolocation element? Maybe input type equals geolocation. It's only available in JavaScript. And sure, I'd probably use the JavaScript route most of the time, but it would be nice if there were a declarative route available to at least keep that door open. But more and more I see them, the solutions jumping straight to the imperative to JavaScript solution without considering, is there a way to do this declaratively as well?
But to some extent, isn't that because of the nature of the way people do engineering now? Because a lot of the things that you see today, like if you look at the frameworks and the way people work sort of in, I suppose, the professional realm of things, right? They're trying to solve problems that they particularly have, right? Frameworks develop out of the fact that I have a problem that declarative or even imperative, just generic, straight functional programming that I might want to do is not going to solve for my team. So a framework gets developed out, and then that becomes the hotness of the week of, the thing that's on top of the list, and everyone says, we're all doing this now. Let's all move over here, throw away all that other code and go. And that's kind of an echo chamber, right? You see it all the time. It's the same sort of debate. I shrug and don't read them anymore because to some extent it is the same debate. But there is a difference there, right? There is I must solve a problem side of life where, to your example, geolocation, right? You can do it in JavaScript, but there's not a declarative tag to do it. But with things like web components, technically there could be, right? We can build our own geolocation tag to do it. And while we don't necessarily end up with a pure fallback, the concept of sort of the progressive enhancement side of life. Because I look back, and I've been around long enough to know, like, when jQuery hit, what did everyone's web development workflow look like? Let's copy and paste some imports into the top of the thing, and now I have a web page and it works. So from a declarative standpoint, it wasn't purely declarative, but people understood sort of the basics of how to get there. And to some extent, I think web components actually takes us a little bit back to that, where you say, hey, you download this thing and stick it in a folder, and then you put this little thing in here and import it. Now, I'm not saying that gives you, the fall down chain across my watch to my television, but from a basic level, you could do quite a bit of work as a getting started thing. But we're not necessarily teaching people that at this point either.
No, you're absolutely right. I think the end game of web components is that we have a more declarative way of creating websites. Compared to, say, today, as you say, a lot of people, it's all happening in the JavaScript, and the HTML is literally open body tag, close body tag, right? There's nothing there, and it's all happening in JavaScript. And the end game of web components, writing tags, they're just much more powerful tags that, someone else has created, and all you have to do is drop them into that page. I totally agree with that end game, but the issue is how we get there, and this is where I have disagreements with other people, about web components, is that we see eye to eye on that declarative endgame, but we differ on the upgrade path of how do we get from what we've currently got to that more declarative future. Because you're right, I mean, done right, web components kind of bring us back to not having to rely on JavaScript for absolutely everything. There's also this idea that it becomes this virtuous circle with the standards process that, in the same way that you mentioned jQuery, it's a good example. jQuery absolutely influenced standards. We got query selector and query selector all because of jQuery, and that was a good example of developers needed to be able to do this thing. There wasn't a way to do it in the browser, so natively. So there's this like library or framework or polyfill or something that lets them do it. Everyone does it. We should definitely standardize that. And the idea with web components is that could happen again, right? Again, we're looking big picture, looking at the future, that when web components are out, if 95% of people are using the same web component for an image gallery or the same web component for some interface element, then the idea is, well, we should standardize that interface element, bring it into the browser in the same way we brought in query selector and query selector all, because it's proven itself to be something that developers want. That's the theory. And what I'm worried about, and I think maybe this touches on what Bruce was mentioning as well, what I'm worried about is maybe the opposite happening. That we get to a situation where 90 to 95% of people are using the same carousel or image gallery element, and we go to the standards body and say, hey, this should totally be a native element. And instead of bringing it into browsers, they say, well, there's no need because you've already got it with web component. And we are already starting to see that pushback when we say, oh, we really think we need a way to do X. And the answer coming back being, oh, use web components. Like,
I
that's
think
the
there's
way
a
to do
big
it.
challenge there, though, where it's not just because a lot of features that are built into HTML and declarative interfaces are more for the user, right? So like even a CMS user, right? Just adding some elements and things like that. But I think web components, the main goal is to enable developers to build frameworks and component libraries. And so there's a challenge there because it's sort of not conflicting interests, but different interests in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And this is, you know, you mentioned earlier about me asking this question, how well does something fail, as well as how well does something work? The other question I like to ask is, who benefits? Who benefits directly from the technology that we're talking about? And it's interesting to compare something like web components, it's all part of the Extensible Web Manifesto, with another part of the Extensible Web Manifesto, which is service workers. And in some ways, they're very, very similar. Both are kind of umbrella terms that refer to exposing low-level browser APIs that previously only the browsers themselves could access. So in the case of web components, it's custom elements and shadow DOM. In the case of service workers, it's the fetch API and the cache API, right? So on the one hand, they seem really similar, right? They've got the same philosophy in terms of exposing underlying APIs. But when you ask the question, well, both how well does it fail and also who benefits, the answers are different, because with service workers, there's a clear end user benefit. If your browser supports service workers, you're going to get a better experience. You, the user, are going to get a better experience. If your browser supports custom elements, you're going to get my custom elements, but there's nothing that I couldn't have done using, you know, divs and spans and JavaScript and CSS. It would have been tougher for me, the developer, to do it without web components, because I got to think about styles leaking and all the encapsulation problems that we currently have on the web. But the end result to you, the user, would have looked the same. The whole point of web components is that it makes life much, much easier for developers to share those components, right? That I can make a web component and literally give it to you and you can drop it in and it's just going to work and it's all encapsulated. Now, that's a great problem to solve, right? Developer convenience is hugely important. But I find it hard to treat it as importantly as user needs. Like if there's direct benefit to the user, that always trumps for me any developer. Argue, you know, anything that makes the developer's life easier automatically is better for the user because the developer is working faster, more efficiently, therefore the website's going to be better. But I'm talking about direct benefits here. So you're absolutely right that the end user of web components isn't the end user of the website, it's the developer. I even find that sometimes reading the specs and reading the articles about web components confusing because they'll use the word user, but they don't mean user as an end user. They mean users and the person who takes the web component that's been designed and built by somebody else. What's a good way of designing web components for the user? And that user is another
It's
web
like when you're
developer.
developing an application and you have different profiles like admin or whatever, you know, sometimes you'll mix the at least I do. I'll mix the terminology in meetings and be like, oh, I mean this user in particular, but yeah.
Yeah, but in web standards world, these words actually have very defined meanings. Like, you know, author means something and user means something. The same way that was it should and must and all of these words are very clearly defined in standards documents.
Specs are hard. I mean, I think that's no way to slice and dice it. I mean, from a user perspective, I mean, we have a lot more user engagement from a developer level now in the specs process, right? We have the working groups. Specs live on, working drafts live on GitHub at this point, where you have a lot more conversation about so many different needs, because you're right. You've got developer needs, you've got end user needs, you've got corporate needs, you've got browser needs. Like, you can go down the list all day long, and like everyone has a particular need that they need this particular thing to do, because the web is so pervasive. Trying to juggle that into this wonderful thing that we have, my hat's off to them. I sit there and I lurk on those lists going, I want to answer that question, but I don't want to get screamed at for 3 weeks.
Yeah.
It's a very difficult process.
Yeah, but they do have guidelines. There are design principles. And one of them, probably my favorite of the HTML5 design principles, I mean, that's a pretty nerdy thing to admit. I have a favorite HTML5 design principle, is called the priority of constituencies. And I think I can quote it from memory. In case of conflict, consider users over authors over implementers over theoretical purity, right? So theoretical purity is, the ideal spec. It doesn't matter. Implementers are the browser makers. We are the authors, we developers, and we should have actually more of a say than the browser makers in theory. But even our needs are trumped by the user, and the user there's the end user. So users over authors over implementers over theoretical purity. And I think that's a pretty good design principle. And when I have sort of waded into the design, the HTML process, that's generally where I would call them up. Say, I think the route you're going down is maybe against that design principle. You're considering, the implementers more than the developers, or the authors more. You're considering the authors more than users, that kind of stuff. So speaking for the user, I think, is something that maybe doesn't get done enough. And you're absolutely right. The process now is so much better. It's on GitHub. Anybody can contribute. Well, anybody who's used to using GitHub. But it is still a lot of developer needs that are getting solved, and the end user doesn't necessarily have a voice in there. Worry about who's speaking for the end user. In theory, we're all supposed to be considering the end user, but in practice, I wonder whether we're thinking more about our own convenience. But that said, these things don't need to be in opposition. It's not like something that's good for the developer is automatically bad for the user. Most things are good for both.
Sure, but to your point, that's a very good claim, because we have a lot of guests on the show, and one thing that comes up is you should be thinking about users, and a lot of developers sometimes forget this fact. We look at the things we build as theoretical, towers, on the hill of, oh, look at the magical thing that I built that works wonderfully for me, but no one else. The ideology trumps all else, and you see a lot of that in just conversations. But when we forget the user, that can be a very bad thing. Like, that's bad enough when you're building an app. That's horrible when you're building a spec.
Yeah. I mean, on that note too, I don't know if you've seen this, Jeremy. I should have showed it to you before the show, but Jan oh my God, Jan, the awesome guy from Component Kitchen. Sorry, Jan, you can smack me later. He did this this wiki on the gold standard for web components, and Alice Buck's also
I have seen that. Yes, yeah.
And Rob Dotson, and there's some really good stuff on there. And it's not necessarily a spec; it's more of like a style guide for building web components, in my opinion. And I mean, what are your thoughts on something like that? Because like when I read your article and I read Adam's article, I was thinking to myself, I should really stop using attributes to put content in as much, unless it's text, right? Because if I have a carousel as the canonical answer, right, you need to have those images there, because it's just going to render a span, and then those spans are going to be there. So you need like shadow DOM in a lot of cases to support that injection into your component. But if shadow DOM doesn't work for whatever reason, or JavaScript doesn't work, at least that content will render. Probably like, crazy looking. It won't be very pretty, but the content will be there.
Yeah, we're not aiming for parity here. We're not saying that everything has to be exactly perfect in a browser that doesn't support web components as in a browser that does. It's just let's have something.
Yeah, and I think
that's really. Sorry, I was gonna say, I think that is really important as well, because I think sometimes, especially when people get defensive about some of this stuff, that's what they're thinking. And you're like, well, that's impossible, and then why would I even do this? But it's not that, oh, it has to look and work exactly the same on a browser that does and doesn't support a certain anything. It's that it's just like you said, it's that something is there.
Yes, exactly. This comes up again and again when I'm talking about progressive enhancement, and I think a lot of people really don't like that term, because I think they misunderstand it. And that's fine. I'm not wedded to the term, but I think a lot of people think that progressive enhancement means you have to provide exactly all the functionality, let's say without JavaScript or without CSS, as you do with CSS or with JavaScript, and that's just crazy, right? It's about thinking about, well, what's the core functionality? What's the one thing that I want all my users, no matter what kind of device or browser or network connection they got, that's the one thing I want them to be able to accomplish. Make sure that's available using the simplest low-level technology, and then go crazy. Then, add in all the enhancements and the latest APIs and enhance up. Don't stop with that simple version. I'm always reminded of Matt Marquis, who worked on the Boston Globe site, and he's a big proponent of progressive enhancement. but he said, you know, there's a whole bunch of features that require JavaScript to work, but reading the news isn't one of them. Making that distinction between the core functionality and everything else. And I think when people do get defensive about this stuff, they think that what people like me are saying is like, I'm slapping their wrist and saying, no, you must make sure everything works without JavaScript. You must make sure everything works without this technology or that technology. And that's not it at all. It's just, you know, keeping in mind what's the why a user is visiting, trying to make sure that that at least is available with the least number of technical requirements, and then going crazy. Because once you've done that, you've kind of given yourself carte blanche, right? You've made this baseline that's available to everyone because you've used really simple technologies. Now you've kind of given yourself permission to go crazy with whatever the latest new cool API that just landed in the browser is, regardless of browser support, because at least you know if it doesn't work, it's not catastrophic. You know, everything's going to fall back to something at least. So yeah, it's a crucial point that we're not talking about parity, right? That the idea that with web components and without web components, the end user should still get the same result. Like that's crazy. But yeah, that the end user should get something instead of, you know, a blank screen, that doesn't seem crazy to me.
Yeah, and I think what I was getting at with the gold standard too is that, you know, a lot of times developers will look at a code base and will say, what is the most common way to do something? Okay, I found this, and this is how I make a model. I'm just going to make a model this way so I'm consistent with the code. And I think it's important to have those defaults, like not necessarily best practices, but to have like defaults so that developers know this is what we recommend because of X, Y, and Z. And I think with the gold standard, that really kind of defines that really well. And I'm wondering if it needs to have something added in as far as like understanding abstracting content.
Yeah, I would like it if that made it in there. But first of all, I mean, I have to say, I just love that the gold standard exists, because what it shows is, you know, people are thinking about this stuff. And that's the more important thing, that you're right. People, instead of just blindly accepting a technology and using, you know, copying and pasting code without thinking, that there are people thinking about what's best practices when it comes to performance or backwards compatibility or whatever it happens to be. That's excellent. I would like it if there was more in there about the backwards compatibility sort of thing, but just the fact that it's happening at all is really good. And your point about defaults is so important. That is so true. I see this again and again, because you're right, like, defaults really matter. The default way of doing something is the way most people are going to do it, right? In the JavaScript framework world, for example, this is, you know, getting away from web components, but you got all these big frameworks like Ember and Angular and React, right? And there's things you can do with all of them, but some of them make it easier than others because they're the default. So give you an example of server-side rendering. Ember is currently doing this whole fast boot thing, so that out of the box you get server-side rendering. They're kind of leading the way with that, which is surprising considered talking about it previously, but they've really, you know, embraced the idea of server-side rendering. Now the React folks can say, yeah, but React has always been able to do server-side rendering, you know, right out of the box. And it's absolutely true. React can do server-side rendering, but it's not easy. It requires a lot of hoops to jump through, right? Whereas the whole idea, and I think what Tom Dale and the people at Ember have realized, is that you have to not just make it possible, you have to make it easy. You have to make it default, right? Yeah, and I would like it if in the world of web components, the easy way, the default way of using web components was that there'd be some kind of backwards compatibility. This is probably why I like the idea of the is attribute, because it seems to expose that a bit more. And I think the more people would by default, you know, consider the backwards compatibility. But it absolutely comes down to defaults. It's not, you know, the technology itself is fairly agnostic. You can use it in many different ways, but how we use it comes down to what's normal, what's the consensus on this stuff.
I think Ember and Angular succeed a lot more at that than React. Just a little off subject, I know, but just because, you know, especially Ember has a very opinionated way of doing things, and if you do it that way, it works awesome, right? And Angular is the same way. I haven't used Angular 2, I don't know, but at least when I was using Angular, it was very much like that. And React is like a view layer, and there's not a lot of. I just started using React recently. And there's not a lot of, hey, you need to use this particular Flux implementation. You need to use this particular type of linter, they just pretty much say, here's like 20 options, and go have at it. So it's very
more like it's bare bones, and then you
daunting.
have to flesh out what's on the bones yourself, and find a way that works for you. It's true. No, you're absolutely right that of those frameworks, I would say Ember is probably the most opinionated. Right, it has strong opinions on how it should be used, and if you agree with those opinions, you're going to have a good time. And if you disagree, you're probably going to be battling it the whole way. But I really respect the fact that it makes no bones about having a strong opinion, even if I don't personally agree with the opinions. Just the fact that it's saying it has an opinion, because the truth is that every framework and every piece of software has an opinion, because even if you don't want to have an opinion, you can't help it, because you're a human being. Human beings have biases. We come with all this baggage, and we do embed that into what we create. We embed that into the code we write. There's assumptions, the assumptions that are so deep buried we don't even realize they're there, that we embed it into the code we write. So by being opinionated, something like Ember is actually just acknowledging what, frankly, all frameworks and all libraries do, which is that they have a point of view. One of my colleagues, Mark at Clear Left, he's been building this tool recently, a tool in Node called Fractal for generating pattern libraries. And his whole idea was that it should be as unopinionated as possible. And he's really succeeded very well, because you can use different templating languages. You don't have to use a particular file structure or anything. It tries to not dictate anything. But it's really hard. It's really, really hard not to, make assumptions or embed your own bias into software. Even when you write the documentation or you provide an example, you're going to provide, you're steering people down one particular route and cutting off other avenues, whether you intend to do that or not. So, we talk about opinionated software, but to a certain extent, all software is opinionated. And it's funny how much, of course, this conversation, design principles keep coming up again and again. I think that's how we acknowledge that, okay, we're human beings, we have biases. Let's acknowledge that, and let's try and figure out what we want to embed into the software we build. What are the values we want to put into what we're building? So yeah, whether it's HTML design principles or the web components gold standard, by this way of exposing the thought and ideas that go into software.
Well, and to some extent, it's the opinion side of life is generated based on experience, right? We all have experience building lots and lots of types of software, particularly if I'm the old person, right? So I know, like, I've seen all kinds of random software development, and over the years you form your own opinion about how to build things based on horrible experiences you had. Yeah. Which is why, like, you talk to framework authors, and they are brilliant people making some amazing software. And people go, oh, it's opinionated, and I'm like, you probably, I always say, how long have you been doing this? Because there's a reason the opinion formed and the experience generated the thing that it did, because they needed to get some work done, which is why, it's one of those, oh, okay, this is the way it is. But it is incredibly hard to separate your experience from building anything, because in the back of your mind, you're going, you know what? I know that one project we did, we had this problem. If I don't take care of this now, someone else may have this problem. And then it just sort of builds up and stacks up. And that can be, hats off to them for building that, because trying to build unopinionated software, that is a very hard thing to do. Yeah. Very, very hard.
Extremely hard. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And when people do, build code for us to use, I mean, it's wonderful that people do this. They give us, free code. It's great. But they are embedding their own experiences, their own life histories into that. And if they correspond to our own experiences, then that's great. We're going to work with that tool. It's going to be good. If they've got different opinions, then we're going to be clashing with it. We'll talk about travel broadening the mind, and I think web developers could afford to travel a bit more, in the sense of maybe get out of their offices in their own particular situation with, a high-speed connection and a great phone and a fast Macintosh computer, and maybe go to where, slower connections, there's a multitude of devices, people using proxy browsers, all this kind of stuff, just to challenge some of our assumptions, and also to expose that there's a wide range of experiences, certainly on the user side. I think the world of web developers, it's fairly varied, but it's certainly more homogenous than the world of web users, right? There's far more users than there are web developers. good for us to try to be exposed to as many different viewpoints, as many different, ways of interacting with the web as possible. Because then maybe the software that we'd produce would account for other experiences.
Well, and a lot of the times when people say, I don't want to use web components, because I gave a talk last weekend, I give a lot of talks on it, and I always hear a wide span of opinions and experiences about it. And I'm always very curious because it helps me write better talks and better content and go back and talk to people. But a lot of people say, I don't understand web components. And I say, well, have you ever used components in anything on other platforms? Have you used, did you ever work on Windows? Did you ever work on OS 10 or some other random platform thing that was, a set-top box or whatever? Did you ever work with components on those platforms? And a lot of people say, no, I've never actually seen components. And I think that a lot of times the conversation goes to the fact that people don't quite understand what components are supposed to be necessarily when you're starting to architect and build software. So if we don't sort of address that and say, oh, it's trying to solve this problem that a lot of us had because the web didn't have components as a whole. But oh, by the way, you may not have known this because you've only ever worked with Framework X or whatever. And Ben mentioned this in his talk at Polymer Summit the other day, or yesterday, I think it was, that they had to retrain some engineers to understand what the stock web platform did at ING, so that they could build components and other things they needed internally to do. And that's I hear that a lot more than I think people realize, that people are like, oh, I'm only doing this thing, and I'm very, I've only done this thing.
But I think web components are a bit of a tough sell because, as I mentioned earlier, that question of, well, who benefits? If there were direct end user benefit to web components, I think it'd be easier to say, well, here's why you should use them. Your user is going to benefit. As it is, the benefit is to the developer. And you're right. If the developer you're talking to hasn't experienced the problem that web components are aiming to solve, then why should they investigate web components? I mean, there's a very good chance they're going to experience that problem further down the line, right? It's a fairly universal issue. But I mean, I don't think you should take on a technology unless it's solving a problem you have, right? I think they are a tough sell, web components.
Hey, you brought up Polymer, so I wanted to kind of talk about that as well. So there's projects like the Polymer shop demo, which Eric Beitelman talked about, I think at I/O, if I'm not mistaken. And since the past couple of years, Polymer team has really addressed some ally issues, or the accessibility, backwards compatibility issues. Do you think that a technology like Polymers, which is really powerful, enables developers to quickly create these web components? Do you think something like that, is something that is good for the web as far as looking at things holistically? Is it progressive?
It could be. I think it needs work. The shop demo is a good example. It's demonstrating a lot of really good things in terms of performance and responsiveness and all this good stuff. But under the hood, it is an open shop-app element with the word shop in it, and then close shop-app element. And everything else is like, that's the entirety of the body tag in the Polymer shop demo.
So if you look at view source, you're saying that's all you see is one component.
If you view source rather than view generated source, there's nothing there. There's just the word shop, right? Nothing more. Everything else happens in JavaScript. Now, if you got the assumption that, okay, but the JavaScript is going to load and everything's going to be fine, then from then on, it's all best practices all the way. There to consider a bit more, okay, well, maybe, and frankly, it demonstrates what I think is an anti-pattern for web components, which is that, you would put your entire site into one web component. Like, I don't see the point of that, because the whole idea is that you're separating out into, discrete individual chunks that encapsulate their behavior and their style. Like, it makes there's more in web components that do small things, right? I remember one of the first web components that we saw in the wild was on GitHub, where they had the time element that was just, slightly changed into a custom element that did, a couple of things. Yeah, custom element. I actually think there's more winning of the hearts and minds by showing that kind of stuff and good examples of those little wins than there is in this big monolithic thing that works great if everything works great, but fails disastrously if something goes wrong with the JavaScript.
I think it's a trade-off there. Yeah,
like I said, the end game, absolutely, we're all in agreement. That we get to this more declarative web and web components. It's just this how we get there, and I think that some of those big monolithic examples where everything's wrapped up into one custom element, they're not doing web components any favors, I think.
I had that experience when I built out a demo for a client, and I built it in web components, and I was using Polymer, I think 0.5 at that time, and I was building my own components in Polymer, and I found that communicating with my elements back and forth, and I don't think I understood the models as much back then either, so it was passing data back and forth up these, using some events but not much. I was using attribute IO mostly, and to go deep into those, it was very confusing and very restricting. But I look at the stuff that the Polymer team has done, and like Polymon, which is that new, Pocket Monster type of app that they built for Polymer Summit. It's amazing the stuff they're able to get. They're able to do a lot of things that are, helping developers quickly build stuff. So, I mean, I'm kind of torn. It is a trade-off.
Well, and I think from an example standpoint, I think we simply need more examples. I mean, we're looking at finding patterns that work well for the web now, right? I mean, we've got Purple now, which, gives us a performance boost in terms of rendering, which, it's based on the Rails sort of concept of I want to paint things faster. How do I do that? I need to push, I need to pre-cache, the normal sort of things. But at the end of the day, to your point, yeah, we need more examples of what basic usage might look like. And I know that with beta.webcomponents.org, there's a lot more sort of examples in there, particularly with the way they render those things in real time in those pages that sort of make it easier to understand how a component might work. Whereas before, I think it was very difficult for an end user to look at something and go, you know what, I want to just put this in my web page. How do I actually do that? Where I didn't need a tool chain and I didn't need all this, and I just really wanted this XYZ element that was going to do magical thing at Y for me.
Yeah, drag and drop it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I agree. I think we do need other types of examples, because the one thing that software engineers have a tendency to do, because we have experience and we have opinions about things, is that we build examples based on those things. So we're going to test some tech. We're going to write an example that's going to resolve a problem that we particularly have, and here you go. But that may not be valuable to 90% of people out there. So we do need a lot more basic example sets.
Yeah, and I would like to say, I want to acknowledge that I myself am just being a complete backseat driver when it comes to web components. I write the occasional blog post with my opinions saying, yeah, we need better examples, and somebody should make better examples. It's like, I could be making better examples, right? I mean,
yeah, Jeremy.
I should, put up or shut up. If I don't like the examples that are out there, why don't I create better ones, right? And that's completely valid. And frankly, that's exactly what I should be doing.
Yeah. Brian Cardell's very good about that too. Like, he'll just throw up some, we'll have a discussion and then he'll be like, check out this gist, send me a link. And he'll have some examples. So, I mean, there's people who are doing that.
Well, we're all guilty of that, though. I do the same exact thing. Someone goes, how do you do this? I'm like, well, maybe like this. And then you throw some sample code in a gist and go, it kind of looks like that. And then it never gets written up. I paste them all over the place. I got them in Google Docs, for heaven's sakes. What are you in right now? Here's one. And that's not a good way to distribute information, right? From a learning standpoint.
The stuff that Monica has been doing on Polymer, and some of the other developers as well, working with these elements in there, makes me think I've been working in an application now where it's just that application that houses this component. We have a component that's built for this application. Could it be shared? Yes, but it's just in there. And all we're thinking about with these components is, how does it work in my app? There's no what Monica and the team at Polymer do is they have to consider all these scenarios, and they're building it from the mobile first up as well. So if you stick it anywhere, it'll work. And I think a lot of people look at that and go, oh my God, I have to totally rethink how I'm building these things now if I'm going to share them.
Well,
Yeah,
I
they
think
not only have to consider that stuff when they build it, they also have to communicate it, because they also write, the documentation to go with it. Here's how it works. Here's how you use it, and they're kind of amazing, the work they're doing. Not just building this stuff, but also providing the rationale and the explanations. Good communicators. That's as important as good coders.
Yeah, and it's also, I think some of that stuff is also kind of interesting when you say, like, could we use this somewhere else? Sure. You can also completely torpedo your productivity if every little thing that you're trying to make as generic as possible. You can completely, like I said, you just throttle your progress from what you're trying to do when you try to do that. So it's important to think about those things. It's also important to think about when you need to be doing those things.
Yeah, like the premature optimization. Yeah. I had this just today. We were doing an exercise at work where we're naming patterns, naming components of an interface, and we just kind of exercise. We cut things up, print out the interface, cut it up into small bits, and then we all sort of write down what we think the name of that component should be on a post-it note, and then we all show our post-it notes at once and discuss the names that we've written down. But it's so easy to say, like, oh, it can't be too specific to the content, so let's try and keep it, just abstract enough. But you go on that route and you end up with names like stuff and things, right? It's like, well, that's generic.
We suck at naming things, don't we?
Exactly. Naming things, it's always going to be hard.
Yeah, no, it's tricky. I've actually been running into that. So at work now, so I'm working on an Angular 2 project, and we have like a couple private repos that we import to several different projects, and trying to define then when, because we have a core library that's like, this is what our inputs look like and all that other fun stuff. But when you are trying to decide what goes where, things take longer. As soon as you decide that this thing that you were building should belong in core, it takes way longer to finish it, because the way that you have to build it doesn't just perfectly fit your use case, and you end up like, oh, well, should this be a config object, or should we pass this in as multiple properties? And so it can be tricky.
Yeah, and this makes me wonder about this. The perceived end game for web components, where 95% of us are all using the same web component to do our image galleries, so let's standardize on that as a native image gallery in HTML. It's like, or will it be that 95% of us are all using completely different image galleries, because they're all slightly different, because they're tailored for our own individual needs and our own individual websites, and there is no canonical perfect one that gets shared around in the end, and we just end up using web components to make snowflakes, perfect little snowflakes for our own websites, and not shareable things for other developers. I don't know.
I think that's been a problem before web components were even thought of too, because I've had this issue with jQuery. I think it's much better now with the ecosystem, but I totally agree. Distribution of these things and discovery of them, that would be so helpful to have. But I mean, we're working on that on webcomponents.org. We're trying to get together, the beta.webcomponents. And that'll make it easy for developers to quickly publish their own web components that they have on GitHub, but it's not canonical, right? There's customelements.io. There's no way to say, hey, my hamburger menu is much better than this hamburger menu. And I don't want to use a hamburger menu either. There's going to be like 20 hamburger menus out there, and you have to decide, do you want McDonald's or Burger King or whatever?
Well, and to some extent, though, I think it balances itself out again, because in the jQuery days, what happened with the jQuery days? Oh, look at all these jQuery plugins that were XYZ. And then what happened is that the ones that weren't up to snuff just sort of floated into the oblivion, and then things sort of bubbled up to the top. My suspicion is that web components will be very similar, where you'll have this core set of things that get used. And the nice thing about the new webcomponents.org sort of catalog is that there are collections of things now. You can define collections, say, you know what, this is a pretty decent collection set for me that works, and maybe you would want to use it too. And I know these things are composable together into the thing that I want it to be. Because I think the composability part is where things go awry. Because to Danny's point, if you pre-optimize too soon, you're not in good shape. But if you have components that are relatively contained in the APIs that you develop, that do specific things that are composable across the board, then you have a very good experience. But I think with that also comes from the experience of being a software developer engineer. You've over time learned the pieces of a puzzle that sort of go together to create bigger things. And that just comes with time. I think you have to break some stuff, you have to make some mistakes, and then you have to sort of, oh, maybe I should build this differently next time.
Yeah, the comparison with jQuery is interesting, because I've drawn the same comparison myself, web components and jQuery, in that there is a Darwinian aspect to it. Yeah, everyone is going to write different ways of doing it, but the good stuff's going to surface to the top. But there was also that issue that jQuery itself, I knew I could trust jQuery, right? It had maintainers, it had people working on it. Whenever it came to a jQuery plugin, I didn't know whether it was going to be good. You know, do I take the author's word for it that it's good? So what you end up doing is you end up trusting where you got it from, right? Like which website you downloaded it from, or who was the author behind it. And that's probably going to happen with web components too, that we'll have trusted places that we go to for our web components, or trusted people that we think, oh, if it was written by that person, then it's bound to be a good web component.
Well, no, and that's a very valid point, that back when that was sort of the way that everyone sort of hashed out jQuery things. I mean, as I recall, there was the jQuery plugin sort of site that ran on the .org that was kind of never really maintained. It kind of got rebuilt and then it didn't. And then it really wasn't a canonical source for anything really, because the versions were usually not kept up. The tooling overall from a developer standpoint lately seems to have gotten better. Like, you know, we coalesce around things like GitHub and Bitbucket or GitLab, and then, but even then, now you've got 3, and then, okay, well, then we coalesce around web components and custom IO and, you know, other sort of vendors of those things. So then it starts to spread out a little bit more. So I think it will be difficult, but to your point, I agree. I think you end up with canonical sources where people just have a tendency to flow and go to look for those components over time. But yeah, the jQuery ecosystem was rough. You were always like, what version is this supposed to be on? Where's the source control? There's no source control. It's just the thing that I stuck up here, and it's there.
Yeah, and it sucks because some of them, you know, like I remember I had to do one that was it was a tree view, and there's not many of those, right? And like we don't have to worry about that so much now because we're mobile first mostly. But
I like my tree folders, Eric.
But like,
just trees everywhere.
To do that tree structure yourself, right, from scratch, such a pain. But I ended up monkey patching the hell out of that thing because there was no way I could. I ended up doing probably half the work I would have done if I rebuilt it, but it was just not maintainable, and that was very frustrating. Now we have like versioning and npm and and Bower.
Well, it was a wild west. Like it really was very. I mean, you want to talk about the open web. It was an open time for all because it was a very different way to sort of build the things that, the web was sort of founded, really sort of jettisoned into in the sort of Web 2.0 world of things. I mean, it was a very different thing. I think people have a tendency to forget that because either A, they weren't in web development at the time, or B, they're just not old enough to remember it. That's cool. Like there's a lot of history behind the decisions that we made in terms of the way the web platform evolved forward. And a lot of, you see a lot of conversations around that. Well, I don't understand how the DOM works. I don't understand why is JavaScript the way it was. Because people had deadlines and
because
things happened.
Yeah, no, something that's been the web from the day one is this idea of sharing. It was the motto of the web when Tim Berners-Lee and Robert Kaya were working on it. Let's share what we know. And right from the start, people have done that on the web. Hey, here's this thing I figured out. I'm going to share it with you. And especially in web development. I mean, that's how I learned web development, was reading other people's blogs and sites and tutorials. And in a way, things have got better now because not only can we still do that, but we can also use things like GitHub, and now we've got version control and issues and forks, and it's like, wow, this is like the web getting a power boost. And in some ways, the very philosophy of web components is encapsulating that. Like, well, if you solve a problem you build that's encapsulated, you should be able to share it with somebody else. So, again, the big picture of web components very much embodies that spirit of sharing.
Sometimes I feel like software developers live in this, I guess, utopia of Star Trek,
Yeah, we got replicators making code for us.
It's awesome.
Code, Earl Grey. Hot.
I know we've gone over a little bit, and I know. Are you able to answer just a couple more questions, or do we have to go? If you got to go, I totally understand on that.
I have time for a quick question. I think everybody else probably needs to go.
Yeah, I got to get back too, but
not everybody, but I do need to drop off right now. So I'm sorry I have to cut and run because they're about to talk about something that I want to know. I'm curious more about. But Jeremy, thanks very much. It was great to meet you.
Likewise, it's a pleasure.
Thanks, Danny. So there is the idea of when Eric Biddleman talked about progressive web apps and web components, he did mention JavaScript class extension, and that's how Polymer 2 is going to be working now out of the box. And that's one way to look at some progressive enhancement. And I know we talked about one of the things that bothers me about not is particularly, but especially JavaScript class extension, is that you can only extend the HTML element, element prototype. So I couldn't go in there and say, I want to extend HTML li element, or I want to extend select element. That's not allowed. What are your thoughts on that sort of stuff?
Well, to be honest, if you're already in the JavaScript layer, then it kind of doesn't matter. I mean, I know theoretically the idea is that you would inherit all the things that, say, a select already does. You inherit all the things a list item already does, and then you just add on the bits you need. So I get that, but I'm more concerned with it being in the declarative layer. Because once you're already in a JavaScript, like, you could just add it. Maybe you import, here's how a select works, and just do it. I honestly don't have too much of a strong opinion on the extensibility once you're in the JavaScript. My opinion is more around having some kind of extensibility while we're still in the HTML.
And we used to be able to do custom elements as the element tag, but that was like way too hard for browsers, I think, to implement.
Yeah, and I think that's at the root of WebKit's opposition as well, is to do with there's too many going on where it isn't easy to predict exactly what this element is that you're extending, right? Because there's other things could have an influence on that element and the state that the element is in. Are you extending an element in its default state, or are you extending an element that's already been interacted with? And it gets messy, and I have a lot of sympathy for the browsers.
So there's one more thing I wanted to talk about. We brought up a couple of times. We didn't really get too much into, but server-side rendering.
Mm-hmm.
So sort of like a little contentious, especially with web components, for the reason that people say, well, who cares? It's just HTML. But the problem is when you have these APIs that are DOM APIs, the DOM doesn't exist in your JavaScript builder, right? So you need some virtualization of that. And so there was one, I think Jordan Last had created this, I think it was, what was it, Justin? Was it Electron based, but it had Chromium running? It's like super resource hog. I can't remember, but it was able to
I can't remember the name off the top of my head.
Pre-render. It was able to pre-render custom elements with Shadow DOM and everything. So that's interesting because the Shadow DOM is one of the harder pieces, right? Because if you do that with the way you would do isomorphic, or with even if you do something as simple as handlebars, right? You're not going to get. It still has to hit the browser before your Shadow DOM is going to work.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
what are your thoughts on that as far as progressive enhancement with that?
Well, I think a lot about server-side rendering because it is a big topic when it comes to progressive enhancement and JavaScript frameworks like React and Ember and Angular and all that. But to be honest, I hadn't really considered it in the world of web components. I've sort of, I guess, mentally kept those things separate in my head because, I would have assumed that web components is something that we're talking about. We're already in the browser at this point. The server at this point is kind of out of the picture.
Well, Tim Perry has a set of tools to do it without Shadow DOM on GitHub. Okay. He was on our podcast as well, but it was interesting to look at both those projects though. Like we had Rob Dotson on, and he was talking about it as well. I can't remember everything in the episode because it was way over my head. There's a lot of cool stuff there.
Yeah. I saw a talk by Rob, and he was talking a lot about the extensibility stuff. So I think he's fighting the good fight for getting a declarative extensibility.
I think that's it for the stuff that I had to talk about. Justin, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Oh, I could talk all day long, Eric, but alas, we
so
probably should. You should not let me talk all day long. It's amazing you still let me on here.
I feel like Justin and I could, we could share a porch, and we could yell at the kids to get off our lawn.
I feel like we can. I mean, I've got enough gray at this point where, it is funny because it just sort of cycles around. It's a circle. And I'm like, yeah, I remember that. I remember that too. Okay.
All right. Well, you porch dwellers, let me ask you something. Jeremy.
Yes.
If people want to find you, they want to learn more about progressive enhancement, your feelings on web components, what's your Twitter handle, and how can people get in touch with you?
So the canonical place to get in touch with me or find out anything about me is my own website, which is adactio.com, adactio.com, and there I post, longer form stuff, shorter tweet size stuff, which then gets cross-posted to Twitter. But the canonical form is always on my own website. And if I have opinions on stuff, that's where I'll speak my brains. There's not too much stuff on web components on my own website, I have to say. That's not really my area, but there's lots of stuff on progressive enhancement. And I keep track of links and stuff, and try to keep on top of stuff there as well. And I post all the links on my website. So adactio.com. If you do want to find me on Twitter, it is adactio as well.
Yeah, even though there's not a lot of web component stuff, there's still some really meaty pieces there. The service worker stuff that you had, just progressive enhancement in general.
Yeah, I'm very excited about service workers. Yeah, I'm probably going to be writing even more about service workers.
It's good stuff.
They are so lovely.
Thank you for coming on the show. Really appreciate it. And hopefully, are you going to head out to Chrome Dev Summit?
It clashes with FFConf here in Brighton, which is a terrific front-end development conference. So I had to make the choice, and I've gone for FFConf because it's great, and I would recommend
it. It is a good one.
Yeah, I recommend it to anyone.
Well, thank you for coming on. We appreciate it. This has been episode number 111, Extensible Web Components.
Thank you.